Welcome to The Art of Adventure. This is 5 Minute Friday, and this is a quick run through of my journey as a digital nomad. That is all the different businesses that I've had that let me travel the world and create freedom in my lifestyle. And I often talk about this when I'm speaking publicly, when I'm doing workshops and keynotes and things like that. And then people come up to me afterwards and they say, I want to hear how you did it. And I think, I just said that. I just said it in my talk. But what this is telling me, that people still want to know how I did it. It's like they don't believe it somehow, or they don't really understand what's going on because they haven't done it yet. And until you do it, you really can't know what it's going to be like. And again, it's different for me from anybody else. And you also don't hear all the boring things that go on in the background, the following up over and over again to try to make something happen, the tens of thousands probably of hours of work behind the scenes, banging your head against the wall, obsessing over should you do this or that, trying to figure out these things and taking small little actions and moving things along. That doesn't make for compelling storytelling, but just know that that's happening for every entrepreneur, for every digital nomad behind the scenes. And that if you try something, it might sound quite simple, but it's probably not going to be easy. It's probably going to be 10 to 100 times harder than you ever thought it was going to be. An example of that is when I thought, it's going to be so easy to write a book because I have all the material. Well, 2 years later, when I finally finished the book, I had written 60,000 words and it took way, way longer than I expected. So let me walk you through my journey as a digital nomad. And it started with the desire to be an entrepreneur. And I didn't actually put full-time traveling in with that desire right away. I just started a coaching business. I was coaching cyclists because I was a pro cyclist and I was teaching younger cyclists how to become pro. And I was training them to be better athletes, to be better racers. And I had 4 or 5 clients, and I was charging about $250 a month. So when I decided to leave grad school and go abroad, I was looking at Asia and South America, 2 places where you can live for about $1,000 a month. So I needed 4 clients. I needed 4 cycling coaching clients paying me $250 a month to equal my cost of living, expected cost of living in these countries. And when I had that, I basically knew that I could travel indefinitely. So that gave me the confidence to go ahead and go to Vietnam, which was my first country that I think of when I started my digital nomad journey. Now, there was a time when these coaching clients, after I had worked with them for a while, they graduated and moved on or hired another coach. And I didn't have any clients. I didn't have any income for probably several months. And that's when I started this podcast, The Art of Adventure. And of course, like everything, when you expect to get rich quick, podcasting for me was not a get rich quick game because it's a free show that I'm creating. So it's hard to sell that. You need to sell it for sponsors, and you have to have a really big audience and all these things. We have a small niche here. So it's never been the get rich quick scheme that I expected. But lots of other people kept asking me, how do you start a podcast? Can you help me do it? Can you walk me through it? Can you give me advice? And I thought, sounds like there's a business opportunity here. So I started hosting these podcast launch groups. The launch your podcast in 1 month was the value proposition. And people would come over to my house and we'd all sit around the kitchen table and we'd practice interviewing and we'd learn how to set up a podcast feed and we'd test our microphones and all these things. And I probably helped 60 people launch podcasts over the time that I was doing these, where I was a podcast coach. And, if we did a group a month and there was 5 people and they were each paying, I don't say $400, right? So I made $2,000 in that month. Great. Awesome. Twice my cost of living. Heyo. Again, you're living for super cheap. So you can actually be saving money if you're making $2,000 a month. And in the US, you're probably going to be spending more than that. So it's part of about where in the world you're living. It gives you a longer runway to try stuff. About that time, I started doing a lot of talks. I started speaking for free at co-working spaces and events. I knew that I liked to be on stage. I did improv comedy in college, and I thought that all the stuff that I'm learning on the podcast and all the books that I'm reading, I can teach this stuff. I like teaching. I like being on stage. So I started speaking for free, thinking towards the future that eventually I could get paid to speak. Then on episode 49 and 50 of this podcast, I had David Wood as a guest, and he's become a good friend of mine. And he, in those episodes, talked about how easy it is to start a coaching practice. And from him, I ended up hiring him to teach me how to become a coach and coach more broadly about business and life. And so that's how the coaching branch of my business was born, an idea from a guest on the podcast. And I've taken so many ideas from guests on the podcast. If you've listened to this show and you've taken ideas from it, if you're like, ooh, yes, I want to try that, that's what happens for me as the host when I'm interviewing someone. Often I will leave an interview with a really good idea. Almost everyone gives me a good idea. So a lot of the stuff I've tried because I first found out about it during an interview on my own podcast, The Art of Adventure. And that includes writing a book. Another later guest suggested you should write a book. You should use the content from the interviews that you've done and turn it into a book. And that was the book that became Superconductors. And I launched it as a crowdfunding campaign on Publishizer, who's now a sponsor of the show. And the book did well enough that we got a publishing contract. And then I spent 2 years writing it, which again was way harder than I expected it to be. And about that time, I think it was just before I started writing the book, I started running these Adventure Quest trips. And the first one I did was in Bali, and I had a relationship with one of the eco lodges. So I gathered 3 of my friends and we went up to the highland central volcano region of Bali for a long weekend. It was like a 4-day trip. Maybe it was a week. I can't remember. It was a pretty good trip. And that was the first Adventure Quest. And I was testing out the idea of what it would be like to bring entrepreneurs out into the wilderness and coach them in business and in life while they're going on these adventures. And that's continued to evolve, including the next Adventure Quest trip we have for influencers coming up in Morocco in October. And so, wow, influencers, I had to learn to be an influencer along the way too. And I saw people on Instagram, which you probably have seen, they get a bunch of followers, they get a bunch of free stuff, they start to go on free trips. It's pretty cool. So I said, I want to do that. And it actually didn't take very long for me to start getting free trips. The very first free trip that I got was a trip on the New Zealand Scenic Railroad. And I said, hey, I have 1,000 Instagram followers and a podcast. Will you give me a free ticket? And they said, okay, that's fine. I was really surprised. And since then, I've gotten way more than I would ever have expected just from my Instagram and having a podcast. I've probably told all of the stories that I'm telling here today, all the steps along the way, you can find in more detail elsewhere on this podcast. But if you've never heard the entire journey before, hopefully this is helpful for you. Another guest on the podcast, Jasper Ribbers, said, I have this house and I rent it out on Airbnb, and basically I travel full time from the money I make on Airbnb. So I had in the back of my mind, that would be a great idea. I like to have a home base in the US, in St. Louis, where I grew up. And I also want to be making money while I travel. So it was always in the back of my mind that I would buy a house and rent it on Airbnb. So when we found the right house, which is a 4-bedroom house, you can rent it out to large groups here, and it's right next to universities and hospitals and the stadium. So it's in a really good location. So that's one of the next steps, branches of the business that we did, was to buy a house that we live in part-time. And then when we're traveling, it's up on Airbnb. So the timeline we're talking here was starting in 2015, 16, 17, now talking about 2018 when Superconductors was published. That's when we started renting our house on Airbnb. That's when I became a publisher. I published a collaborative group book project with 50 co-authors. Each one are coaches. That's called Activate Your Life. And you can find that on Amazon as well. And so that became the, 7th or 8th different thing that I've earned money doing over the last 5.5 years. So that's 8 businesses in 5 years. That's about every 8 months I'm starting a new project, which isn't super fast or super slow. And I'm definitely busy all the time. And, I continue to put effort into previous businesses. Like I'm continuing to coach. That's something that I've never stopped. And I'm continuing to podcast and all these things. So as I add businesses, I also add team members. I end up hiring people. We have a podcast producer. I have a general assistant who helps me with so many things. So as I add things to my plate, I'm also delegating and hiring to take things off my plate, because otherwise it would be ridiculously busy. One thing that you might expect from me already would be an online course. And I actually shot an online course with Laden Juracek. He's the host of the Travel Wisdom podcast. He came to my house in Croatia in 2017, and we spent a week creating and shooting this course. And it just didn't get to the point where we felt it was good enough to sell. So that never became available for you to buy, but it's definitely something that is important. And I'm in the process of writing and shooting an online course as we speak, as this episode is being recorded. A few other things in the works are the next book proposal that I'm working on right now, which is about transformational experiences and the leadership lessons from those experiences, and how, transformative travel and transformative festivals and vision quests and all these things are impacting our global economy and shaping our socioeconomic systems and structures. So you can see how this business, this digital nomad lifestyle, the things that I'm doing, they're all very interconnected, and yet you might not be able to predict exactly what I'm going to be doing in 3 years, because who knows what podcast guest will come on the show and give me a brilliant idea that I feel that I really need to do. And that's how book projects come to me. That's how the idea for the trip in Morocco comes to me. It just makes sense. And I like to leave space in my schedule to take on new business opportunities when I think they're really important. So that brings us up to date. That brings us to early 2019 when this is being published. And it's been a 5.5 year journey so far. And I expect that at some point, now that I have kids, I'll slow down, do less travel. Already, it's, as you can imagine, slower to travel with 2 kids than it is to travel solo. So, of course, it's going to change and evolve. And that's what's exciting about it. So hopefully that makes it a little bit more real for you. Hopefully that you can understand, how my business went from one phase to the next. It's fairly straightforward. Again, it's simple, but it's not necessarily easy. All the work that goes on behind the scenes, you have to have strong motivation to do it. You have to really obsess about it. And it's perfect because I do. I obsess about the podcast and coaching and the events that I create. And I've already talked to hundreds of people about this book project. This is even before I've started writing it. So that's the inside story of my trajectory as a digital nomad. Let me know if that's helpful for you, if you took any good ideas away from that. Also, let me know if you're still curious how it all works, because if this is something you really want to do and you want to understand it on a deeper level, it might be time for you to hire a coach, which maybe that's me, maybe that's someone else. But if you really want to jump into this, expert mentorship is so key. I've had so many coaches. I have 3 or 4 right now. And that's a huge part of it, is first the motivation, then the expert teaching, coaching, and guidance, and then getting down to work, taking action and practicing and trying to be as good as you can of an entrepreneur and a digital nomad and really a person, because being the best person that you can be is going to make you more successful in so many ways. That's all for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. Now it's your turn to go out there and be adventurous.